Have you ever loved someone who was physically present but emotionally gone? I was 14 years old, standing in our kitchen on a Saturday morning in 1963, when I asked my father a simple question. Dad, can you help me with my history homework? We're studying World War II. He was sitting at the table, coffee growing cold in front of him, staring at nothing in particular the way he always did. When I said those words, World War II, something flickered across his face. Not anger. Not sadness. Something worse. Something empty. He stood up without a word, walked out of the kitchen, got in his car, and didn't come home for 6 hours. My mother found me crying at that same table an hour later. My textbook still open to a chapter about the Battle of the Bulge, my homework abandoned. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat down beside me and put her hand over mine. Then very quietly she said, "Your father's wounds healed a long time ago, sweetheart." But his silence never did. I didn't understand what she meant. Not then, not for years. But that moment, that absence, that silence, that look on his face, like I had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. That moment taught me something about war that no history book ever could. The battle doesn't end when the soldiers come home. It just changes location. Before I tell you why that moment changed everything, let me take you back. My father, Thomas William Harper, came home from the war in December of 1945. I wasn't born yet. My mother, Catherine, was 22 years old, waiting at the train station in her best dress, navy blue with white buttons that she had sewn on herself because buttons were still hard to come by. She had his letters memorized. All 37 of them, short letters. Practical letters. Letters that said, "I'm alive and I miss you," but never said what he was actually living through. What he was actually missing, what parts of himself he was leaving behind in the mud and blood of Europe. She told me once, years later when I was grown and married myself, that the moment she saw him step off that train, she knew. She knew that something fundamental had changed. He was thinner. That was obvious. He had lost maybe 25 pounds, and his uniform hung on him like it belonged to someone else. But it wasn't the weight. It was his eyes. She said his eyes looked like windows with the curtains drawn. Like there was light somewhere inside, but he had decided no one was allowed to see it anymore. They got married before he left, a small ceremony in June of 1943, just 3 weeks before he shipped out. She was 19, he was 21. They had known each other since childhood, grown up 3 houses apart on the same street in a small town in Ohio, where everyone knew everyone, and nothing remarkable ever happened. He worked at his father's hardware store. She worked at the library. They had talked about having 4 children, maybe 5. They had talked about building a house on the edge of town where the fields met the forest. They had talked about growing old together, rocking on the front porch, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. The war took those conversations and buried them somewhere in France. When he came home, they tried to resume normal life. They moved into a small apartment above the drugstore on Main Street. He went back to work at the hardware store. She kept working at the library. They went to church on Sundays. They had dinner with his parents every Wednesday night. From the outside, everything looked fine, perfect, even. The handsome young veteran and his patient, devoted wife. The American dream rebuilt after the nightmare of war. But my mother said the silence started immediately. Not the comfortable silence of 2 people who know each other so well. They don't need to fill every moment with words. The other kind, the heavy kind. The kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The kind that turns a small apartment into a tomb where 2 people exist side by side but never quite touch. He wouldn't talk about the war. Not ever. Not one single story. Not one memory. Not even the easy ones, the ones that might have been funny or harmless. When other veterans gathered at the WW hall to swap stories and drink beer and laugh too loud in that way men laugh when they read trying to forget, he stayed home. When his own father asked him just once what it was like over there, my father looked at him and said, "It was war, Dad. What do you want me to say?" And his father never asked again. My mother tried. God, she tried. She would ask gentle questions. Did you make any friends? Was the food terrible? Did you see Paris? He would answer in the smallest possible way. Yes, yes, from a distance. And then the conversation would die like a candle in a windstorm, quick and complete. But that was only the beginning. I was born in 1949, 4 years after he came home. My mother said she had started to believe they would never have children, that something about the war had made it impossible. Though they never knew if it was physical or if it was just that they couldn't connect enough to create life. But then, miraculously, she got pregnant. She said she cried for 3 days straight when the doctor confirmed it. Not because she wasn't happy. Because she was terrified. Terrified that a baby wouldn't fix what was broken. Terrified that she was bringing a child into a house built on silence. My father held me when I was born. The nurse placed me in his arms, and my mother said he looked down at my tiny face, and something cracked open in him for just a moment. He cried, actually cried. Tears running down his face while he traced my cheek with his thumb, the same way he had probably traced the faces of friends who didn't make it home. Then he handed me back to my mother, and the wall went up again. Solid, impenetrable, safe. I grew up in that wall's shadow. My childhood was full of small, strange absences. My father was there, physically present at every dinner, every Christmas morning, every birthday party, but also not there. He would sit in his chair by the window and read the newspaper while I played on the floor beside him. He would walk me to school every morning, my hand tucked into his, but we would barely speak. He would come to my school plays and sit in the back row, and afterward he would say, "You did good, sweetheart." And that would be the end of it. No questions about my lines, no commentary on the costumes. No stories about when he was young. My mother filled the gaps. She was the one who talked, who laughed, who asked about my day and listened to my stories and helped me with homework and taught me how to braid my hair and explained why the sky was blue and why people died and why sometimes love wasn't enough to fix what was broken. But I wanted my father. Have you ever felt something like this? That ache of wanting someone who is right there but somehow unreachable? That constant low-grade grief of living with someone who is physically present but emotionally gone? I tried everything to reach him. When I was 7, I drew him a picture of our family. Stick figures holding hands in front of a house with a big sun overhead, and gave it to him after dinner. He looked at it for a long time, then carefully folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He never hung it up, he never mentioned it. But I found it years later, after he died, tucked in the pages of his Bible, creased, and worn like he had looked at it often when no one was watching. When I was 10, I tried to get him to teach me things. "Dad, can you show me how to fix my bike chain?" "Dad, can you teach me how to use tools?" "Dad, can you help me build a birdhouse for school?" He would help, but always in silence, his hands showing me what his voice wouldn't explain. And I learned, eventually, that this was his language. Not words, actions. The way he made sure my bike was always tuned up. The way he fixed things around the house before anyone asked. The way he left money on the kitchen counter when I needed something for school. Love expressed through hammers and screwdrivers and things that could be measured and controlled. But I wanted more. I wanted him to tell me stories. I wanted him to laugh. I wanted him to be silly. I wanted him to be human in the way other fathers were human, imperfect and loud and messy and alive. And that was the moment I stopped being who they thought I was. I was 16 when I decided I would break through his silence by learning about his war. I thought if I understood what he had been through, I could reach him. I could show him I wasn't afraid of his past. I could prove that whatever he was protecting me from could unhurt me as long as we were together. I went to the library, my mother's library, and checked out every book I could find about World War II. I read about the European theater, about the D-Day invasion, about the Battle of the Bulge, about the liberation of the concentration camps. I learned the names of battles and generals and regiments. I learned about foxholes and K-rations and the sound of artillery fire. I learned about trench foot and shell shock and what happens to the human body when it's exposed to sustained trauma. I thought knowledge would be a bridge. Instead, it became a wall of its own. Because the more I learned, the more I realized why he couldn't talk about it. How do you explain to your teenage daughter that you watched your best friend die in your arms? How do you describe the smell of death, the weight of survival, the guilt of coming home when so many others didn't? How do you translate war into dinner table conversation without poisoning everything it touches? The night I tried to talk to him about it, that Saturday morning I mentioned earlier, when I was 14, wasn't the first time I had asked. But it was the time that broke something between us. Because I pushed, I didn't just ask him to help with homework. I asked him to open the door he had spent 20 years keeping locked, and he couldn't do it. Or wouldn't. And in his leaving, in his 6 hours of absence, I finally understood that his silence wasn't about me. It was about survival. When he came home that evening, I was sitting on the front porch waiting for him. My mother was inside making dinner, giving us space, though I'm sure she was listening through the screen door. He got out of the car slowly, like an old man even though he was only 43 years old. He sat down beside me on the steps. We didn't look at each other. We just sat there watching the sun go down, turning the sky orange and pink and purple. "I'm sorry," I said. "I shouldn't have asked." He was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to respond. Then he said, "It's not your fault, sweetheart. It's just ... some things don't have words. Some things live in a place where words can't go." It was the most he had ever said about the war. The most he would ever say. I didn't know it yet. But the world was about to change, not the whole world, just mine. Because in that moment, I stopped trying to fix my father. I stopped trying to reach through his silence and pull him into the light. I accepted that he was doing the best he could with the pieces of himself that made it home. And in accepting that, I learned to love him differently. Not the father I wished he could be, the father he actually was. I learned to sit beside him in silence and understand that was its own form of communication. I learned to watch his hands instead of waiting for his words. I learned that when he squeezed my shoulder as he walked past, that was, "I love you." When he made sure my car had gas, that was, "I worry about you." When he showed up at my college graduation and stood in the back of the auditorium looking uncomfortable but staying anyway, that was, "I'm proud of you." My mother understood this long before I did. She had spent 20 years learning to interpret his silence, to find love in the negative space, to build a life around what wasn't said. She told me once when I was in my 20s and complaining about how distant he was, "Your father gives what he can give. It's not enough, I know, but it's everything he has left." And she was right. Stay with me until the end. It's worth it. The war wounded my father in ways that never showed up on any medical report. He came home with all his limbs intact, no shrapnel scars. No visible damage. The doctors cleared him. The government gave him his discharge papers and thanked him for his service and sent him back into civilian life with no map, no guidance, no acknowledgement that the hardest part of war might be learning to live with what you did and what you saw and what you lost. He had nightmares. I know because sometimes when I was young and couldn't sleep, I would hear him through the walls. Not screaming. My father never screamed. Just these low, desperate sounds like an animal caught in a trap. My mother would wake him gently, whispering his name until he came back. And then there would be silence again. Always silence. He had triggers. Loud noises made him flinch. Fireworks on the 4th of July made him physically ill. He couldn't watch war movies, couldn't attend parades, couldn't be in crowds, couldn't handle chaos or unpredictability or anything that reminded him of when the world was exploding around him and he had no control. But he never got help. Because this was the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. Men didn't talk about their feelings. Veterans especially didn't talk about trauma. You came home, you got a job, you started a family, you moved on. That was the expectation, the unspoken rule. And my father followed rules. He survived by following rules. So he locked everything away and pretended he was fine even though we all knew he wasn't. I got married in 1971. My father walked me down the aisle. He looked handsome in his suit, his hair going gray at the temples, his jaw set in that familiar way that meant he was holding something back. When he placed my hand in my husband's hand, he held on for just a second too long. Not saying goodbye, just holding on. And then he let go and stepped back, and I saw his eyes were wet. After the ceremony, during the reception, I found him outside smoking a cigarette, even though he had quit 10 years earlier. I sat down beside him on the bench behind the reception hall, my wedding dress billowing around me like a white cloud. "You okay, Dad?" I asked. He took a long drag on the cigarette and didn't look at me. "I always thought I'd have more time to figure out how to be a good father," he said, "and now you regrown and married and I still don't know if I did it right." My throat tightened. "You did fine, Dad. You did the best you could. That's what your mother says. But I see how you look at me sometimes. Like you're waiting for something I can't give you." He was right. I had been waiting for him to open up, waiting for him to let me in, waiting for him to be someone he couldn't be. "I'm not waiting anymore," I said, and I meant it. "I know who you are. I know what you've been carrying. And I love you anyway. Not despite the silence, just ... completely. All of it. He finally looked at me then, really looked at me. And for the first time in my entire life, I saw the wall crack, not fall. Just crack. Just enough for me to see that behind all that silence was a man who loved me so fiercely it hurt. A man who had given me everything he had left to give after the war took most of it. A man who had survived hell and then survived the harder thing, living with it. I love you too, sweetheart, he said. His voice rough, broken, beautiful. That was 1971. He died in 1992. 21 more years of mostly silence. But it was a different silence after that conversation. Softer somehow. Less like a wall and more like a blanket. Something that covered us both but didn't separate us. In his last days, when cancer finally gave him permission to stop fighting, he talked more than he had in his entire adult life. Not about the war. He never talked about the war. But about other things. About how he met my mother at a church picnic when they were 14 years old, and she had laughed at one of his jokes. And he knew right then he was going to marry her someday. About how scared he was when I was born. Scared he would break me or fail me or pass on whatever darkness lived inside him. About how proud he was of the woman I had become. About how sorry he was that he couldn't be the father I deserved. You were exactly the father I needed, I told him, holding his hand in the hospital bed. You taught me that love isn't always loud, that strength isn't always visible. That survival is its own kind of courage. He squeezed my hand, too weak to say more. But it was enough. He died on a Tuesday morning in March. My mother was on one side of him, I was on the other. His last words were to her. I'm sorry I was so quiet. Kat, I'm sorry I couldn't give you everything. And my mother, who had loved him through 27 years of silence, who had built a life in the spaces between words, who had never once asked him to be anything other than what he was, leaned close and whispered, You gave me enough. You gave me everything that mattered. He closed his eyes. And the silence finally became peace. Share this with someone who would understand. I'm 65 years old now. My mother passed away 5 years after my father. I have children of my own, grandchildren, a life that is full and loud and messy and beautiful. And sometimes when the house is quiet and everyone is asleep, I think about my father. I think about all the words he never said, all the stories he never shared, all the darkness he carried alone so that I wouldn't have to carry it with me. And I understand now, in a way I couldn't when I was young, that his silence was a kind of gift. Not the gift I wanted, not the gift I asked for, but a gift nonetheless. He gave me his presence even when his mind was somewhere else. He gave me consistency even when chaos lived inside him. He gave me safety even when he felt anything but safe. He protected me from his war by keeping it locked away. And yes, that meant I didn't get all of him, but it also meant I got to be a child. I got to grow up without inheriting his nightmares. I got to be light because he chose to carry the darkness. Was it the right choice? I don't know, maybe there was a better way. Maybe if he had gotten help, if the world had been different, if men had been allowed to be vulnerable and broken and human, maybe we could have had more. Maybe the silence could have been broken into something that didn't hurt so much. But we don't get to choose the world we live in. We only get to choose how we survive it. And my father survived the only way he knew how. By sealing off the past. By moving forward in silence. By loving his family in the wordless language of presence and protection and provision. His wounds from World War II healed. The doctors confirmed it. The scars faded. The body regenerated, but his silence never did. It lived with him until the day he died. It shaped our family. It shaped me. It taught me that sometimes the absence of something is itself a presence. That what people don't say matters as much as what they do say. That love can exist in silence, and silence can exist in love, and they're not always opposite things. Silence does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means there's so much inside that words are too small to hold it. I forgave my father a long time ago for not being the father I wanted. But more than that, I honor him for being the father he could be, for surviving, for trying, for loving us in the only way his war-torn heart still knew how to love. If stories like this remind you what dignity feels like, subscribe. You belong here, and don't miss the next story. It is something truly unforgettable.